Good morning and welcome to the MemberWise webcast, Membership Success in 2023, Understanding What Members Value. And today's session is delivered in partnership with Militech. So what we'll be discussing today, I'll take you through the learning objectives before we get started. First of all, we're going to understand how to ensure you're providing services that members truly value. We're going to have practical advice to allow you to measure the value that members get from your interactions. And we're going to hear about membership case studies on how like-minded organisations have been able to improve the value they have provided to their members. So those are the high-level view of what we've got today. And hopefully that's what you've signed up for attending. Today's presenters, you've just met me. My name's Rich. I'm the founder and the chair of the MemberWise Network. I'd like to introduce you to Steve Shields, who is head of product at Militech. Steve, hopefully you're there. Yep, good morning to you, Steve. And Ed Owen, Strategic Account Director at Militech. Good morning to you, Ed.
Good morning, everybody.
And of course, Kerry is going to be making sure that everything runs smoothly and delivering our Q&A session at the end of today's session. So just before we hear from Ed and Steve, I just wanted to, if you like, frame today's content. So in terms of setting the scene, should I say, the delivery of member value is critical more than ever during challenging times. And I think we'd agree that currently we are having or experiencing challenging times. So it's something that really should be a priority for your organisation. There needs to be a real mixture of tangible and intangible member benefits. So when we say tangible, perhaps they're more the transactional benefits of membership, perhaps a conference, perhaps a product or service, but then also the intangible benefits that come along with membership. So, for example, the sense of belonging, loyalty, those kind of deeper benefits that need to be mixed in with the more tangible. So in terms of the purpose and where value actually sits, there is a direct correlation to member retention. And obviously, one of the things the network has been promoting, certainly over the last 10 years, is the fact that it can cost 8 times less to retain a member than it can to recruit a member. So the better retention we have, the better we can deliver. And obviously, the delivery of clear member value and the enablement of member engagement is directly correlated to that. The value piece may be quite a subjective one, but it's our firm belief that actually the member value piece is better to deal with that and get that right before moving on to the member engagement piece. And I know the analogy that we use is, if you imagine building a house, you want to build it on a rock. You definitely don't want to build it on sand. If you're building it on a rock, that member value piece is really clear and crisp and will help you from a member engagement perspective. If it's not, then that can mean that there'll be problems later on. So in terms of the numbers of organisations that have clear value propositions, if you've attended one of our sessions, you'll already know it's only roughly around about half. So there's still around about 40 or 50% of us that really do still need to improve that member value proposition and statement that goes along with it. And certainly, if you want to look at the best practice guides that we've got and listen to our speakers today, I'm sure they'll be providing you some really good examples of how you can do just that. So basically, we need to get member value sorted. And at this point, I'm going to hand you over to Ed, who's our first speaker of the morning. So good morning to you, Ed.
Morning, thank you, Rich. I am going to jump straight into sharing my screen, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Bring this up. If you wouldn't mind, Rich, just give me a nod once you can see some slides.
Yeah, that's perfect. Over to you.
Perfect. Right, good morning, everybody, and thank you for making the time to join us. So, as Rich has alluded to, we're going to talk about membership value today, which is a very broad topic. So we're not going to be able to cover absolutely everything on this. And we wanted to try and take a bit of a spin in terms of our experience as a technology provider and the context around working with our clients on solving some of these challenges that they have in terms of delivering increased member value across different disparate systems, etc. So in terms of content for our session, Rich has given quick introduction to me, I suppose. I could glaze over that quickly. But for those I haven't met before, Ed, nice to meet you. I'm the Strategic Account Director at Militech and Clear Course Membership Services. So my role sort of overspans looking at working with clients, looking at the challenges they're having and planning sort of strategical things around where they want to be going with their solutions. Steve will be joining me on the call today, who's our commercial head of product. He's sort of the eyes and ears for the customers in terms of the product direction and a bit more technical than myself. So he's going to lend a hand today talking about relevant examples, working with clients in this area around membership value. So we'll be sort of handshaking between ourselves today in terms of going through the content with you. But in terms of agenda points, so we wanted to give a sort of definition to member value and how we like to think about it. We'll come on to that in a sec. What the impact of perceived member value can be, and some considerations that you should have in mind, again, using some context of where we've discussed these examples with clients before, and then some practical things that you can be doing to try and remove waste work from your organization, which will hopefully then increase member value for your members. And then we'll be wrapping up with Q&A at the end. Rich said we haven't got interactive polls, so sometimes those that have been on a session with us before, we've had questions going through the session. But if you could drop those in the chat, and then we'll pick those up at the end. And yeah, so that's the breakdown of what we're covering today. So I'm going to jump straight into talking about why we wanted to talk about membership value. So Rich referenced the membership priorities report, and that's something that we've been using as a basis of a lot of content this year, which I was going to do a bit of a recap in a minute. But obviously membership value is key to everything that we do in membership, essentially. So we talk about engagement, acquisition of members, retaining members, but that's all driven by this central theme of, do the members value it enough to exchange with money, or exchange their time to be part of your membership organization. So understanding this, being able to define it within the organization, and having a language that you can use within the business yourselves to kind of help improve that is pretty key for any membership organization. And when we've been looking at content this year, we've done a few different themes. So this was a kind of as we're coming to the end of the year, we did a reflecting, looking back of working with MemberWise this year and what content we've done. And we've covered a few different things around KPIs, member engagement, busting engagement myths, solving member retention. But all of this kind of links this theme of how these different areas around engagement, acquisition, all lead back to membership value. So sort of pointing that we end on this point and hopefully give you some practical tips today that you can take away. So when we think about breaking down member value, or what is member value, there's two sort of key themes to this. One is the actual value. So these are the tangible things that your members will receive by joining the organization. So that might be participation into a network of other members. It could be training materials, access to an LMS online. There's a whole bunch of different things. Maybe it's that they can have access to qualifications that are available through your network. But it's kind of the tangible things that we'd expect someone will get in return for being part of your membership organization. And then there's the sort of harder to define, but the perceived value from members. And those are things that aren't necessarily explicit in terms of being a part of your membership organization, but it could be the experience that they have with you. So they've joined the organization, but how was that joining experience? How's the kind of customer service that they're finding as being part of your organization? And that's something that we want to focus on today, because that's something that we, from speaking with clients, can see can be overlooked. And I think there's a few quick wins in relation to particularly technology that you can help to sort of avoid and improve this perceived value. So that's, and the other key thing is they all obviously feed into each other. So it's not the distinct, the perceived value is an overlaying thing around your membership organization. And it is, of course, quite subjective ultimately. So that's a little bit of context for how we're considering membership value. I'm actually going to stop talking and pass over to my colleague Steve now, who's going to put a bit more meat on the bones and provide a context around a case study, a customer example, so we could see the impact of perceived membership value in the member experience.
Thanks very much, Ed. So I'm going to look now at how we can consider perceived value through a worked example from one of our clients. So we worked with an organisation earlier in the year who were implementing the Militech CRM and offered a value proposition around providing real help and support at a local and specialised level to their members. So the actual value that the member got from that offering was the advice and support. And what was undoubted through that particular offering was just how popular the service was. We sat in a call centre and saw call after call coming in, and the process that we observed was that members would make a phone call, it would come into their customer service department, and that would be routed out to a volunteer who would then work on behalf of the member at either a local or specialist subject. So first and foremost, actual value being delivered to the member. But when we digged a little bit deeper into the perceived member value, there was some real points of improvement that we felt could be provided. So if we can move on to the next slide, Ed. So as we started to look at the perceptions of that offering, we found that there was a black hole in the process of delivering on this service. And ultimately, once that call had come in from the member had been triaged and processed and moved across to the volunteer, the call would fall into a black hole. And we spent some time with both the customer services team, the volunteers, and listening to calls. And what we found that there were multiple reasons as to why that black hole occurred. There were time pressures on behalf of the volunteer, which made it difficult to respond. Volunteers felt the CRM that they were using at the time was not easy to access. It was slow, so they didn't necessarily buy into the system. Volunteers were not always aware of the tasks because they'd been assigned within the CRM system, but they'd maybe not checked it. And within the customer service department, there was a lack of an audit trail. They were unable to set reminders. In some cases, the member had actually received their service, but the systems hadn't been updated. So the customer service team would get back in touch with the member and actually find that the actual value had been delivered, but the information wasn't there to show that had happened. And all in all, whilst it undoubtedly is a great service and is providing actual value to the member, the organisation's perceived value that they were delivering through that particular offering was not quite so good, because ultimately the service that the member is receiving to get to that point could be improved. So to recap on what we observed through that particular journey, the organisation was absolutely delivering actual value to their members. Members were receiving that specialised advice that they so dearly were looking for. But ultimately, the perception of the organisation was taking a hit in getting to that point. And moreover, additional work was being completed by both volunteers and customer service staff in order to deliver that service. And ultimately, that led to frustrations with staff, volunteers, and members. So all three parties that were privy to that particular call, to that process, ultimately were leaving more disappointed than when they came in, despite the service actually being delivered. And we think that's really important when we look at value, is to go a little bit deeper into what perceptions are coming through the value that you're trying to deliver, and then that helps to design processes effectively. So how do we look at the process itself and start to get under the skin of what's going on and help to eradicate some of those negative perceptions from the value that you're ultimately offering? I now want to introduce a concept of want and waste work. And it's a way of looking at what you do day to day to understand where you're adding value to the member, and where maybe processes are being completed that are not adding value. So if we start first and foremost with our wants, ultimately and ideally day to day when we're interacting with members, we want all of those engagements to be want demands. So people coming to your organisation, being interacted with for reasons that are consistent with your purpose. So I want some advice. Can I have some help with my application? They're value adding requests that ultimately will add value and grow that perceived value that the member receives. Conversely, we then have the concept of waste or waste work. So those are requests that could be prevented by doing things in a different way, ultimately stopping that request coming into the business. Because ultimately, if you are receiving waste work, i.e. you didn't get back to me, what do I have to do? I didn't get the right advice, I can't do this, how will I do that? Those are going to negatively impact on the perception of your organization. And just to pair back to our example from a few moments ago, if you're ultimately providing the correct actual value to members, but in doing so, you're seeing lots of waste work through that process, then the perceived value that member received is ultimately being negatively impacted by the way that they've got from A to B. So I now want to take a little bit of a closer look at the concept of waste. So we categorize that as spending time doing things that could have been done right the first time. So ultimately that things are maybe being done in different ways and therefore different outcomes for the member. Waste will, of course, include duplication of effort. So the same task is being completed time after time, which each time that task is being completed, it's ultimately having a negative impact on that perceived value. I'm sure there's loads of examples out there where when a member calls in and says they can't do this, we give them that particular remedy to the problem, but ultimately that waste can be designed out in some way. Waste is ultimately doing things that add no actual value to the member or the organization. So if you're interacting with members or performing tasks that are not ultimately providing value, then we ultimately don't want to perform those tasks. Of course, such a big one in my years in the membership market is the completion of unnecessary forms, paperwork, reports, and it's very commonplace that member applications may come into businesses, for example, via an email and then are keyed back into a system which might take 10-15 minutes to perform. And of course, absolutely, we don't want members of staff doing that. It's a waste of effort that could be spent providing actual member value or driving up that perception of the organisation. And closely aligned to that waste would be working from unreliable or inaccurate information. And certainly through our case study earlier, we saw a scenario where the customer service department didn't have all of the information at their fingertips to be able to serve the member request. And ultimately that created wasteful onward actions through the process. And then finally, we have checking things that have already been done. So having to hand off work, ultimately a waste of time and effort, which is not providing value to the member. Okay, so we are, of course, technologists, and we provide CRM solutions that generate data. And the notion of waste is closely aligned to the data that is recorded, and that data might be through CRM systems, but it can also be through email inboxes, a record of phone calls that have been taken and so on that might not overtly be captured through the system. But the key point is that in order to find that waste, it's a case of using data to understand where those most frequent waste works are completed. It needs to be a bit unemotional in finding that waste. Quite often we can have perceptions internally of big problems, but if they're not happening on a frequent basis, if they're not creating huge amounts of waste in terms of time and effort, it might not be the best areas of focus. So using data to help us to define the frequency of wastes that are occurring through your business will help you to focus your time on the correct areas in order to get the most bang for your buck in terms of driving out waste and therefore increasing member value. So I'm now going to hand over to Ed, who's going to build on that concept of waste and look at how we can identify where they occur and how we can start to remove those from your organisation in order to drive value.
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, once you have the concept of waste, the key thing is being able to then start to define it, identify it within the organisation, and hopefully start to reduce it or remove it entirely. So very keen on trying to provide you with practical steps on how to start doing this stuff proactively in your organisation. So here's a simple step-by-step guide. It is very high level at this stage. Each one of these stages would have a lot more detail underneath, but for the purposes of today's session, you want to start by ultimately identifying and describing the problem. So that could be just an anecdotal issue that you're seeing happen within the organisation. Maybe it's the fact that your members are making complaints about not having updates, for example. So you've identified the problem. Then you want to consider, and this is something you might have to discuss with multiple teams across the business, but is understanding what the root cause of that problem is. Why is it the fact that the member isn't getting update? Is it because someone wasn't notified? In this story we talked about before, maybe the volunteer wasn't aware that they had to take that action, or they weren't passing the fact they'd done that action back to the customer service team. So step 3 is you want to look at different ways of tackling that problem. How could we work differently? And we'll come on to this a bit later on, but is it a people thing, a process thing, or a technology thing in terms of how you could look at that solution? Then you want to pick one ultimately to come up with a solution and an action plan for how you're going to deploy that. And then step 5 and 6 is starting to actually practically see whether that solution has the impact. So putting the solution in place, and then we were just talking about the data tracking. Let's see what the impact of that is against your sort of hypothesis, if you will, of what you think the outcome should be. So is it going to reduce those emails, calls from members requesting or chasing for updates? That's kind of your desired outcome, and you need to be able to track against that to make sure that it's working. So thinking about those 6 steps, this is a simple format, sort of issues log that you could take away and replicate within your organization. So again, left to right, you start listing what is the waste description, what is that problem challenge, a quick example, member chasing for a case update, what's the impact that that's having. Again, in the context of what we're talking about is member value, so what's the impact on the value that the member's receiving, what departments are affected by it. As I said, this most often be across different areas of the organisation. What's your solution? How are you going to remove it? So what's that idea there? So in this case, provide members with automated updates. And how do you measure it? Before you deploy the solution, it is probably worth thinking about how will you be able to track the outcome of this? And something, again, like going back to KPIs specifically, but you do want to think about whether that aligns with your objectives and whether you'll be able to actually have a metric that you can quantify against to say, actually, we have seen less calls and it's quantifiable to see if it's going up or down. And then logging what the action taken was and the results that come out of that. So that'll be an iterative thing that you do on an ongoing basis, and potentially seeing how the results have happened in the first month, second month, so on and so forth. So what I'd suggest is you could replicate this format, take that away, and then between yourselves and teams start to jot down, I guess as a starting point, what you think some of these areas of waste could be within the organisation. And it might just be useful for you to think about it in this context to build a plan of how you can start to tackle it. What you might end up with is a long list, and then you want to whittle that down to where's the biggest impact going to be. And there'll be different ways of how you can tackle it, and some of those ways of tackling it might be we need to implement a whole new technology, and that's a bigger thing to consider. Maybe it's a small, simple change to a process, and that's something quicker and easier. And potentially there's maybe something that could be, let's make a quick change, and if that starts to work, but it's not very scalable, i.e. we're sending lots of manual updates between each other, but we want to replicate that, potentially that's when then you make a decision to invest in the technology to automate that for you. You've kind of built in you've tested your hypothesis if it's going to deliver the value you want in advance. So we'll send out these slides so you have this, by the way, but that's quite a useful template to use when you're trying to consider this waste work. And I touched on this earlier, but the sort of implications, the things that you might be considering, the actions you might be taking in terms of the organisation will be making changes to people. So that might be implementing more training, changing who is responsible for different areas of the process, for example. Maybe different people are doing the role entirely. And then there's other things like the processes. So that could be quite a simple change. Maybe there's a gap in the process that you've not identified. Maybe you don't have one, and you need to think about what happens in these cases. If somebody is chasing for the second time, is there an escalation that needs to be added into this process now? And then technology, which we're going to come on to in a sec with Steve, is thinking about, in our context, what might we do with a solution to help you with that, whether that's pulling all your data into one place so that you can see it, whether that's automating so that some of these emails go out so you're not having to do the manual work, and yeah, integrating systems so you've got a view of different areas of the touch points with members, so if it's online that you can see that and then respond to it accordingly. So yeah, that's bringing in these three key areas of the organisation that might be impacted by removing this waste work. I think I blasted through that, Steve, and I'm going to promptly hand back to you.
Yeah, sure. So as we move towards the solutions to waste and ultimately driving member value, I want to now start talking about the context of technology and the implications on the technologies you deploy. Ultimately, CRM projects that we work on, our key aim is to make sure that we're building on solid, valuable foundations and not implementing processes against things that ultimately aren't adding value. So the reason for talking about waste today is to drive towards eradicating that, to grow that perception, drive that value through our technologies. So when it comes to deploying maybe new technology interventions or replacing systems, and we're going to consider requirements for those solutions, there are three key questions that we think should be asked in order to validate whether that requirement is going to ultimately add value to the member. So does that requirement support a want request? In delivering on that requirement, be that through CRM or other pieces of technologies, online technologies, for example, is it going to add value to the member? Because ultimately what we don't want to do is to deliver on requirements that are not going to do that. And then on the flip side of that, we get, does the requirement eradicate a waste request? And it's something as technologists that we see quite often, that requirements for solutions have been built on a maybe as-is basis. What do we do now? What does that process look like? But ultimately, those requirements are wasteful in the way that they do that. And then, of course, we have, does the requirement deliver actual value? So what is our value proposition? Is it delivering on that value proposition? And if the requirement isn't delivering on that value, then need to think carefully about whether it's a requirement that's right for the technology that you're looking to ultimately deploy. And we see that quite often through maybe new pieces of work that we're embarking on, where we've have lots of requirements, there's lots of things that we want to do, but ultimately there's an investment in making sure that we are delivering on actual value, and that's driving what the member wants from their membership. So leading into the how with requirements capturing in particular, I know through the MemberWise event last week, and also the Tech Insight Day that we attended back in September now, that there was lots of asks for help and support in driving the correct requirements. And what we see as technology providers is requirements that have maybe been written towards the way that a solution works now, or maybe a preemptive idea of how a solution might work in the future to deliver a particular requirement. But ultimately, and taking the theme of today's session into account, what we want to do through those requirements is actually to make sure that those requirements don't have waste within them, and not to solutionize through those requirements. So the key there is to explain what the problem may be at the moment in a technology agnostic manner, So think about what it is that you're trying to do in layman's terms. Don't overlay that with the solution itself or a perception of how it must work, because ultimately that's driving a requirement towards waste. So our example here is, as a CRM user, I must be able to prompt volunteers to provide support to the member within X number of days. So the idea there is that the requirement doesn't make any reference to the way in which that's done. It gives us a measure through the X number of days, and it's alluding to the problem that we have in our black hole scenario, where volunteers aren't being prompted to follow up with the member. So there's an implied piece of information there around that prompt that will also ultimately enable us to drive out that waste, ensure that the member is getting the support that they need, and drive up that perceived value proposition through the requirement, and gives a really neat way of understanding what ultimately the organisation is looking to do. And then on the other side of requirement, we have the desired outcomes. So what is it, again, real world rather than technology, that you're looking to do in order to provide that value? We want to make the volunteer aware of requirement for their services. So make sure that the request doesn't fall into that black hole, that the volunteer is abreast of the change. And maybe we could go a little bit further, and we'll provide a few more examples of that in a few moments' time. And also the desired outcome is to keep the member updated with their case. So ultimately what we're doing through that process is trapping the black hole, making sure that the member's happy, and most importantly, in terms of making sure that the tech supports you in that endeavour, is providing real world example of what you're trying to do, so that technologists can then come in and deliver on that requirement ultimately. So through looking at the perceived value that the member was not getting through that particular example with our customer service department and specialist support earlier, we were then able to eradicate the waste through the process and define some requirements that enabled us to do that. So we've picked out 6 requirements around that high level requirement to provide specialist support. So as a user, I want to allocate tasks to another, or a case in this scenario, to another user. We want to automatically notify the member that the case has been allocated. Want the member to know that the case has been acknowledged and that they can expect to receive a response. We want the user to be able to notify the volunteer that they've been allocated. We want the volunteer to be presented with case details. And then subsequently, we want to notify the volunteer to be able to notify when the case has been acted upon. So these requirements are ultimately trapping those problems that we found in the black hole that were ultimately leading towards waste within the process, that were generating more tasks for the customer service, the volunteer and the member in order to provide on that actual value, and make sure that every step of the journey, the member is informed of what's going on with their case, so that they are given the best possible perception of the task that's being completed in order to deliver that actual value through the process. So tying waste back to value, if we can reduce the amount of waste, we can ultimately provide more value to the member. So most crucially, the reduction of waste through process will generate more time for both the member and the membership organisation to deliver value in different ways. Ultimately, that creates space for member engagement. And I saw a great example of this a number of years ago now with an organisation who had a 2-week lead time on providing welcome emails to new members, or welcome pack, should I say, to new members. And through looking at the wastefulness in that process, what took 2 weeks to gather the data on new members, produce packs, get them sent out, and so on, and looking at what was going on there, they were able to implement technology solutions which made that electronic, made it automated overnight, and were able to redeploy the members of staff that were effectively performing waste tasks to get paper-based welcome packs out, and redeploy those members of staff into engagement-led activities, and subsequently saw huge amounts of growth within their membership. Ultimately, by looking into the waste and the perceived value effects that might be created, ensures that you're making your investment into its actual and perceived member value. And if you're investing in technology solutions or processes that are not driving that investment, then ultimately that's money wasted that could be spent on driving more value for your members, creating more opportunities for engagement, and ultimately driving up, as point 4 suggests, the opportunity to acquire and retain members. And ultimately, by being cognizant of waste and the impact that it has on value, it provides the opportunity to cut risks to the investment that you're making. And certainly from my time in the membership space, we tend to see that maybe CRM and digital solutions can be a bit of a magic bullet. A change will help us to ultimately change our organization's working, but if that's not cognizant of cutting the waste through the work that you do day to day, then ultimately that investment will be not well spent or fail. Okay, so we're drawing towards the end of our session today, and I just want to pick up on a few key takeaways from the session. So first and foremost, when considering value, it's important to consider both the actual and perceived value that your members are taking from your offering. So I know that Rich advocates strongly for a member value proposition, which is absolutely right, and will lay out what that value is that you're offering. But please be aware that the perception that your members get when ultimately providing that value can have a significant knock-on impact. Ultimately, and on the negative side of things, waste is a key blocker towards providing effective value, and looking at the waste in your business and in processes enables you to derive that perceived value. What does good look like? We're looking to drive out waste from your business and drive up want demands. So ensuring that when members do interact with you, or you interact with members, it's something that is valued rather than to overcome an issue. And ultimately, consider how technology can help. So technology isn't necessarily the magic bullet, it's an enabler, and the key is to make sure those investments are into driving out waste from the business. Okay, so thanks everybody for taking the time to attend today. We have come to the end of our presentation, so we're now in a place to take any questions that you may have.
Thanks, guys. God, there's so much food for thought in that. I was listening to you and thinking, gosh, there's really something there about that actual versus perceived piece that was not worrying, but really eye-opening, because you're right. As membership people, we go, okay, here's our lovely member value proposition. We're really clear internally about what that means and what the impact is. And there we go. That goes off to the members in all our communications and that kind of thing. And the idea that actually there's a disconnect between that, and that the perceived value might be something completely different from what we're peddling internally is, yeah, I mean, I suppose it is quite scary in a way, but it's also worth thinking about, because I was thinking about this morning, actually. I was thinking about a lot of apps and things, the value isn't actually the content, or it's not actually the thing that you think you're getting the value of. Actually, the value is they made the process really simple, or that the system or the procedure is super simple than if you did it yourself. And actually, I think we get caught up on, oh, well, the value is the benefits that we offer, and it's the quality of the content that we offer. Actually, sometimes the value of it is being on demand, being really quick, being really responsive, the stuff that's actually quite system and processy based rather than content and benefit based. And I guess that's the thing that when I think about, almost auditing the member experience piece, in retail, they do mystery shopping, and there's that sense of, right, get people to kind of test the experience that they have with you as a retailer. I don't think we do enough kind of member experience testing, which is, to get people to really road test the telephone interactions, the email interactions, all of those communication touch points, as you say, that really could flag some interesting discussions about perceived value and also waste. I just thought that was really, really interesting, and it sort of threw things at me. So a really good question from Caroline, actually. How can you measure perceived value? And I guess it goes back to that member survey piece, doesn't it? It goes back to this member experience evaluation. What was the actual value that you got from interacting with this system? Or have you come across organizations that are measuring perceived value in a really good way?
Yeah, I agree and disagree with that, I guess, because I think it's one tool in the armory. And just going back to the statement first, I think there's a natural human tendency, isn't there? It's the old, people will tell a lot more people about their bad experience versus receiving that value, and it's the human tendency to focus in on that bit. And we've definitely had it through members of staff anecdotally who are members of organizations moaning about getting their membership subscription paid or whatever it may be. That's what they talk about, almost not realizing that they're talking about our market and applying that sometimes. And where am I going with that? Yeah, it's a different way of viewing things, and ultimately, in trying to deliver value as we offer this and this, sometimes people are blocked by the sheer amount of work that's been going on to service that perceived value. And we can't do all of this and this because we're too busy over here doing that and that. And so if you keep implementing that, there's an issue there. Going back to the measures, it can go a little bit further in terms of sort of frequency analysis around, if you consider your email inbox customer service at membership organization, it's a great source of information that if frequency wise 90% of emails around not being able to pay your membership subscription, it shows that there is a real perception problem in that area and gives you that resonance on, we need to do something about this. And that might be, as Ed alluded to, people, process, technology, but it's about that data that's at your fingertips in various different guises. We worked with an organization a few years ago and did a floor walk in their customer service department, just quite literally writing down what was that call about, what was the essence of the conversation. 100% of the calls were waste.
Wow, 100%.
100%. Because ultimately, nature of the business, it wasn't an organization that offered, is the example today, specialist help and advice. They were offering services around learning and so on and so forth. So ultimately, if you can get that learning online, or you're taking an exam out in the field and it works seamlessly, in that context, why would you ring the membership organization? But ultimately, the customer service department were 10, 15 people that were servicing calls day in, day out, with interventions that could potentially be designed out of the work. And we as technologists went in and then did some things around what was on the website, what help, guidance, support is the All of those sorts of interventions are maybe the way to do it, but there may be process interventions that stop that upstream as well.
Yeah.
So there's a whole body of ways that you could measure and gather that information about feedback and surveying. Sometimes that will lead you to the answers that you want to hear, and it will be on that actual value deliver. Sometimes it's a case of what is that demand first and foremost that we're servicing, how are we servicing that? And we had on the data slide earlier online activity. So I've seen examples of where people drop out of member joining journeys or event booking processes, which is ultimately failure, waste in the process potentially that's stopping people from getting there, and understanding that we might have an event that's 80% subscribed, but it could be 100% if that 20% didn't drop out, and being cognizant of that is potentially another way of finding that we have a technology problem here that we need to overcome. So no one size fits all, but ultimately data and frequency and focusing time in the right areas is what's absolutely key there.
And actually you touched on this next question, but Sarah was saying, you know, rarely is technology the problem. It's usually the people and the processes that are actually the big, out of those three, that are the ones that can really make it work or not work. So she's saying, you know, how important is it to harmonize those two elements so that the technology solution is great? I mean, how important is it? It's crucial. I mean, it's kind of, it's like a triangle. You take one of those sides away and it's not going to work. So, you know, all three of them are crucial, but it feels like start with the processes, because actually if you can clean those up quite a lot, then you work out whether you've got the right people operating those processes and how the technology can support those people. That to me is an obvious order of those three.
And as technologists, we leap to the technology solution. We sometimes kick ourselves on remembering value at times, because ultimately we think that the value is already there through the people in the process maybe. To that example that we've used through today's session, the problems that organisation were experiencing were ultimately rooted in technology, but it was understanding the people and process that changed the technology intervention. In particular, it was illuminating sitting in one session with a customer service department and another session with the volunteer, blaming each other, for want of a better word, in terms of we don't know this and we don't know that, and we, you know, and it's human nature to a certain extent. But what was really then obvious was that it was nobody's fault. It wasn't a blame thing. It was just a case of the way the technology was ultimately deployed, and there was lots of assumptions through that as well. So they're just lazy, they don't update the system, but actually we haven't got the time. We can't get into the system. We all of those good reasons as to what was happening, which then led to process and then ultimately technology change.
It feels like the ultimate takeaway is don't make any assumptions. Don't assume that it's not the people. Don't assume that it is the people. It's that exploratory phase where you're really trying to get to grips with what the current reality is that will tell you what the solution is. And I think you're right. We leap to, this is the solution, it's to get brand new tech in. Actually, I'm a big fan of spend more time working out what the problem is and less time trying to bring the solution in. Because if you spend more time on the problem, the solution will be really, really obvious once you've done that work.
To circle back to your point as we finished on those perceptions and what really is the problem is a really key point, because we all assume. And in our reflections on creating the session today, it's made us realise that in our world of serving membership organisations, we do exactly the same. So our assumptions are around effective projects and delivering on tech, but quite often when we speak to our clients and we step back, number one is effective support, helping in time of need. And it's when you start to gather that information, you step back, that you realize that there's a bit of science to understanding where value truly lies.
And actually that shifts as well, because actually we've seen in the last 2 years again, the value that people want out of their membership body has now changed because circumstances and life changes. So never think that the value doesn't change either. It's constantly changing as life changes.
Yes.
Kerry's got a good point, actually. There's always a trade-off between high levels of automation versus personalization. And it's like, they're always that sweet spot of what can you automate and what do you need to personalize, because actually both are great and you kind of need both. It's that sweet spot of where should it sit for your organization. And I think that's kind of the bit that feels like you have to really sit down and work out what the value lies in. Does the value lie in the automation, or does the value lie in the personalization?
And it goes a little bit further for me. It's a case of what's the correct response to the problem. And Ed did a session early October on outsourcing versus automation. And really that is an answer to the problem, or there's a perception that problems can be solved by automation. And we've used automation as our example today as a potential magic bullet. But in some circumstances where that problem is going to be different on a case-by-case basis, we've put forward a solution for outsourcing spikes in demand as opposed to automation. That will work in some scenarios and it won't work in others. But it's ultimately looking at the people, process, technology to decide where the right answer is.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, I mean, like you said, there are, we record all of the webinars. There's a special section on the Learn platform, which has all got, the Militech sessions on there. So if anybody does want to go back and watch Ed's, webcast on that, to go back and get a little bit more information about that outsourcing stuff, I would say go and have a watch of that, because there's a lot. That was also quite a meaty one. I seem to remember that was really, there's a lot of content in that one as well.
We're trying to provide a bit of food for thought, but also practical stuff that you can take away, because these are all big topics, aren't they? It's hard to tackle them in value in just one sitting. But I think to go away and think about these things, perception is really important. And I mean, just coming back to the people thing, for me, whenever we talk about technology, people is at the core of it all the time, because it doesn't matter what solution you put in place if people don't use it in the right way or don't buy into it. So there's also change management, both expectations with staff, how they'll change, adapt to the process technology, but also members. We'd like you to renew online, and these are the benefits of why you should do it. This is why you should update your details regularly, so that we can make sure we're communicating with you effectively, and try and not make it a task for them, but there's kind of a benefit as to why you're trying to do this. So the people bit is definitely very important throughout all of this stuff.
Yeah, because actually thinking about, I mean, Rich and I have both worked in organizations where for a lot of the staff, it's either going to help me or it's going to make my life worse, and that's the split. There's no gray. It's either going to be brilliant and it's going to save my life, or it's going to be terrible and make me work harder. And you go, well, in reality, it's a bit of both. Like, there'll be bits, but actually it's not black and white. But mentally, they're kind of putting it in that camp. And so the change management piece is huge, bringing everybody on that journey. And we go back to the issue. It's never the tech, it's never the CRM system you're using, it's how people are using it, it's the data that's in it, it's all that stuff. But it's easier to blame the tech. It's easier to go, well, we'll just start again, we'll just get a new one in. Yes. Easier, who said that on earth was easier? I mean, it's a nightmare doing that sort of thing. So it's easier to change the people and the processes than it is to get the technology sorted, right, Rich?
Yeah, and the thing that we see that sort of seems to be missing is a lot of the time on the side of the membership organisations is that not bringing the people along with them and kind of having this kind of whole process done to them. And I think we saw in even the priority challenge, we looked at all of those key challenges, and one of them obviously was the actual human side of it. So not just the tech, actually making sure that the people are actually kind of skilled up to be able to actually not just deliver it once it's there, but actually play like an active role in the actual kind of the discovery, the scoping, all of that kind of stuff, rather than it just sort of landing on them like a spaceship at the last minute. I know for a lot of people I've worked with in the past, that's been a real frustration for them. And I mean, hopefully, one of the things, Steve, obviously, we've known each other for a very long time. Does it feel like membership organisations are getting better at kind of asking for what they need? Just to sort of turn the table, is that getting better?
I think so. casting my mind back now, sort of 7 or 8, 9 years, and thinking about maybe things were probably a little bit more haphazard in the way that approaches to tech would come about. I do think things are more considered than maybe they once were, but potentially still against that backdrop of solving the root cause ultimately, which is where today's session has come from. And I'm just thinking about that one challenge in the digital excellence report on more and more work for membership organisations. That's a really insular but key point. It suggests trying to do more, trying to do things differently, but also potentially against the backdrop of not delivering value. And therefore, what does that say? More work to do potentially.
Yeah, and I mean, Ed, have you got any observations that you've made? Because obviously, you've kind of seen maybe different environments, and obviously you've seen what happens within membership. I mean, have you felt that things have got a little bit better in your time?
I think so. I think one of the things is that projects are becoming less. This is a bit of a stereotype, but less IT driven and more across the whole organisation. And maybe that's just because everybody generally is much more comfortable with tech now. We've sort of been brought along, we all use it in our day-to-day lives, but everyone now understands the impact of, oh, well, actually, I work in comms and I need to understand this, I need reports on this. So those people are also feeding into the conversations, and that's the right way to do it, because it isn't just, oh, IT have got this idea and this is the right way and this is how it should be hosted, etc. There's a wider impact of why you're actually putting a system in place in the first place. So yeah, I think it's just the wider, and then my advice to anybody on this is looking at these things is to not just insulate yourself to say, well, what's our department, what's the wider impact, who else is going to rely on this information, because they'll have it's not just a member thing, but they'll have a perceived experience in dealing with the other parts of the departments in the organization. So I think there is an improvement. There's definitely us trying to educate as well and provide this sort of content. So as just a kind of wrapping up point, I would say that obviously thank you for joining the sessions, but if you've got any general feedback on the types of things we've been talking about in this session or others, that we're very interested to know where you'd like to spend more time, because we're thinking about content for next year, etc. So definitely very keen to get that feedback so we can help pass on what experiences we have.
Okay, well, I think our hour's nearly up there. So what I'll do, I'll wrap up today's session if I can. Obviously, thank you, Kerry, for the dialogue with the speakers of today. Huge thank you to Militech for being one of our official partners. Obviously, in terms of what we've done throughout the year, a lot of this wouldn't have been possible without your support. So big thank you. And obviously, in terms of today's session, both Ed and Steve, thank you for presenting the content to us. So as I said, the content will be made available on demand. We'll share the presentation in PDF format. And if you would like to share it with colleagues, please do feel free. So on behalf of Militech and MemberWise, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Well, worth saying, Rich, this is our last one of the year. This is our last
yes.
year. We're not doing any more, so you won't see us very soon. You'll see we're back on the 17th of January. So, just have a great Christmas and New Year, everybody, and we'll see you in 2023.
Well done for a great programme over the year, guys.
See you later. Thank you.
See you later. Bye.